Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined today by Terry Robinson. And how you doing today, Terry?
I am doing fine. It's one of those things where I have good news and I slept poorly, so they kind of cancel out. First off, special thank you to listener Trond, who used our affiliate code and then I think literally purchased every RPG supplement known to mankind. If you would like to support us too, please use the affiliate link either in our Discord, discord.me/matesthepodcast, or in our show notes. It is super helpful and means we don't have to add ads or anything to the show. The other thing, when I was doing some research for today's show, I can't remember what search term I was looking for, but the first result that came up included a thread that included your conversation with Paul Strack on the number of mages in the mage world. And I'm like, oh, that's good. People are listening to it. And immediately below that was a link to someone else saying, but also Terry Robinson, Adam's co-host of this book called Ascension's Landscape, that also discusses this topic. I'm like, haha, we are slowly taking over the contemporary world of mage. And that just made me feel good, because like those random things out of nowhere where people are like, we listened to your show, and I'm like, oh, I'm loved. And in these times, I need all that I can get. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. I think it's great that we're seeing signs that people are listening to the show all over the internet. And what's even a bigger thrill for me is the resources that we're providing to mage fans are actually getting their attention and getting recommended by people to other people. So you can't ask for more than that. Well, today on Tomes of Magick, we are going to look at Technomancer's Toybox. And this came out in 1998. It has a number 21 on the spine. It has 7 authors, 2 of whom are Sotiros Brocato and Bill Bridges, 2 authors that are well liked by the hosts on this podcast. The book has about 100 pages. And it is a collection of technomagical devices. Now, that's device with a capital D, which in Mage is when you see that in the books, it's a game term. And it means a technomagical talisman or wonder. Terry and I have been playing role-playing games for a few years, so we tend to defer to the generic term known by many tabletop role players, and that is magic item, which comes from the very beginning of the late 70s for fantasy role-playing games. And this book does give us technomagical magic items. But in Mage, they like to have their own terms. I guess I'm showing my age a bit when I prefer the term talisman, which was the term for the first 2 editions of Mage. Starting with Revised, they were called wonders, which is a great term. I get a little hung up on it because I keep thinking of like the old expression when you're complimenting someone, you're a wonder, or the wonders of the world, like the pyramids at Giza or the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, or etc. But still, both of those terms work equally well. Most Mage players know them. And this book gives us a lot of technomagical devices. Now, in the first 2 editions of Mage, there is no collection of mystic talismans. And Terry and I were talking before the show. We can understand why. Those are pretty easy for just about anyone to understand. Hey, this ring makes you invisible, or these boots help you run really fast, or if you click the heels together, you can teleport. But when it comes to technomagical devices, I think a lot of other Mage fans have heard about other people's Mage Chronicles, where the technomagical devices keep devolving to energy guns, armored cars that can go real fast, and an occasional body armor suit. Not a whole lot more. And as we're on the topic of mystic talismans, before we move into the meat of this book, this is a rare chance for us to just sort of talk about some of the things we found with mystic talismans. I can remember a great one that I introduced to a game that I was running a while back. I took a page from a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. And there was this magic cauldron. You fill it with water and put a fire under it, and then you speak the words, and you can smell the smells that are in the air in the place far away that you specify. And so I just said, I'm just stealing that whole cloth. I don't even care how many dots that talisman is. And so I let the players use that for a while. And I had a lot of fun with it as a storyteller, because every time the players used it, I described a smell to them, and they were certain they knew what that meant. And as a storyteller, I was like, look, I'm just pulling stuff out of a hat. If you guys are certain, that's great. And at one point, I said, you smell incense. And they go, oh, that's it. They're doing a ritual at this chantry. Their guard is down. This is the time to move. I was thinking, oh, is that a fact? All right. And another time, they want to spy on a chantry. And I said, well, you don't smell anything. And they say, okay, move it to the kitchen. I was like, okay, you smell really strong garlic. And they say, aha, the Bettini delegates are coming today. Now is the time to do this and that. I was like, you guys are amazing. I'm loving this. So eventually they had to give the talisman up, but we had a lot of fun with it before it went. Hey, Terry, is there any great quips on talismans you used in your games?
One, I will henceforth refer to that wonder as Adam Sniffin Cauldron, because I just think that's also a good name for, like, if you were to open a small restaurant. I think that would be great. And I love when players take any detail and just completely run with it. My tabletop group recently switched back to Mage after spending some time with Invisible Sun, and I was describing a scene as one character was using time sense of some sort, and I just added this thing where, like, it looks like the character is wearing a wetsuit, and for whatever reason, the word wetsuit just brought this conspiracy theory together. Like, all of the little pieces, all the little strings and thumbtacks came together on the conspiracy board of the mind. They're like, we know exactly who this person is. I'm like, okay, well, that makes one of us, because I haven't gotten that far into the plot yet. But no, I tend to run relatively low wonder chronicles. I have a hard time from a system perspective being like, you know what the solution is? A wonder. I can see in world why a character would do it, but I never really thought a lot of, like, the systems for creation made a lot of sense, and we'll get into that in the show. I am a big fan of certain types of wonders. I do like charms. I like the expendable stuff. I like periaps and soul flowers, things that help store quintessence. I like amulets with sleeping abilities, and I like, for lack of a better term, like, one of the things I liked when we talked about Isle of the Mighty was it introduced the idea that there are types of magic in the world that aren't just sphere magic. So if I introduce something that is a permanent object, I want it to be weird and strange and probably empowered by something that wasn't necessarily a mage. Maybe it was something that was created by a Celestine or Incarna, or some sort of ancient sorcery where the rules kind of differed. So it was interesting for this book just to kind of read so much about our standard wonders and devices. But generally, I use a relatively low magic item count because for as a storyteller, it's another thing for me to keep track of. If a player's interested in it, I have absolutely no problem with it, but I'm rarely going to introduce it if it's something that's going to stick around, unless it's a plot object that will probably go away at the culmination of a story.
I think the operative term for this episode is MacGuffin, and that is an object that the plot hinges on. It's probably an oversimplification, but I think everyone listening gets the idea. And so when they introduced this book, it was not only cool weapons and toys your players can use or NPCs can use against them, but also here's some great ideas for MacGuffins. And that's why a lot of the devices listed in this book don't have from 1 to 5 dots. They'll just have an omega symbol. And, I picked up the book years ago. It's like, wow, there's a lot of euthanatose devices in here. But no, my mistake. It just means omega, like the final letter in the Greek alphabet. It's like we're not putting a rating on this. It's really more of a plot device than it is something to give your players and say, do whatever you want with this and keep it. And so we have a lot of devices of that nature in here. So the structure of this book, it is a big collection of devices, and for the most part, that is the book. We're not going to do the standard walkthrough today that we do in a lot of our episodes. Instead, I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of the structure of the book, and then we're going to get into the content. The structure is there's prelude fiction, there's a short, 3-page introduction, which is just talking to the reader about, this is a book full of devices. They give at that point, what was a new rule for Mage, and that was previously when a mage creates a magic item, a talisman, they lose a permanent willpower point. And I think they were trying to emphasize that theme of this isn't just an object you manufacture and then sell for money and never have a connection to. This is something you put a little bit of yourself into. And at some level, a person could say there's an almost mystical connection between the mage and the talismans or devices that they created. But they say, we want to help everyone understand how technomages make and use a lot more devices. Mystics make and use less mystic talismans. And so they said, okay, when a technomage makes a device with a capital D, they don't invest a permanent willpower point into it. They don't lose a permanent willpower point. And so that explains why there's more devices than there are mystic talismans. So that was interesting to see. And of course, storytellers can make that optional if they choose. There's also the framing narrative in the introduction, and that is there's a virtual adept named Dr. Volcano, and he has a website on the digital web that mages can access, but sleepers are not going to run across accidentally. And that website is a place where mages can connect. They can see what technomagical devices Dr. Volcano is selling, and they can contact Dr. Volcano and try to negotiate a price for it if Dr. Volcano is in the mood. And so that framing device is certainly an interesting one. After that, they quickly switch to a authoritative author's voice for the book, and they say, look, this is just a framing narrative. Use it or not, your choice. Interesting note here, they say websites are notoriously unreliable marketplaces to begin with, end quote. So, hey, all you listeners out there, if you're shopping online, keep that in mind. This book was written by 1998, and sometimes it shows.
Yeah, I think the thing about the frame narrative that I found interesting was that it immediately goes against that first thing where it's like magical items are not something that are just bought and sold, except by Doc Volcano. And you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. I did appreciate, though, the use of what looked like the font Chicago in that frame narrative piece, which to me is always the sans serif font that came with old Macs. That, in addition to the sideways references to Bill Clinton, were the two big blasts from the past for me, I think, in this book.
Yeah. Well, to wrap up the structure, from there we go into a chapter for virtual adepts. We see 18 devices. Then we get ether mages, or ether scientists, I should say, 23 devices. Then we get technocrats, 26 devices, 15 devices from a collection of other mages. We get an appendix with non-magical weapons and equipment and some new skills, an optional rule. And then we get an index of devices, which at the time this was published was very handy because it gathers up brief references to every techno-magical device published, and it tells you what book it's in. Now, here we're in the year 2020, and so it's a little outdated, maybe by, a handful of years. So if you would like something just as convenient and just as useful, the hosts of this podcast recommend to you The Mystic Armory by a friend of the show, Charles Siegel. That is a modern, updated, and very useful index of all wonders and technomagical devices in Mage up to this point. It is still quite appropriate, and take a look at that one. So at this, I think we're ready to launch into the chapters that make up this book, and the structure we've decided on is simply for each chapter. There's so many technomagical devices that if we described every one, we'd be here a long time, and if you have any interest in the book, you're going to read it anyways. So what we're going to do instead is Terry and I, for each chapter, we're going to describe an item that we like, that we think is just cool on its own merits. We're going to list an item that we think a storyteller could build a story around, and we're also going to share something that we thought was silly or ridiculous or worthy of contempt, at least from our own point of view. And then when we get into the appendix, we'll switch it up a bit. We'll tell you something that we thought was a little silly, something that we thought was cool, and we'll discuss those optional rules. So, Terry, start us off with the virtual adepts.
So the console jockeys in this have a wide collection of things that seemingly only exist in the digital web. And this is an interesting case where I, as a reader, have changed over time. That when I read through this the first time, I looked at something like the digital dolls, which are just kind of glorified companionship programs. And when I was reading it as a kid, I'm like, that's stupid. You can't shoot a guy with a doll. But now, as a storyteller, I'm like, oh, I understand how I could include this in a game. You could use that to convey something about a character, that this is how they get their companionship, that they're tired of dealing with regular humans because they never behave as they want them to, and so on and so forth. Which is why the first thing I liked, because I am now adult, and it's more than just guns and how much damage you can do, is Pandora's Random Electrical Transference Inducer, also known as the Pretty Gun. The way this item works is you shoot someone, and then following that, the nearest source of electricity discharges into the person. And I like this because this is one of those ones where you pull out this thing that looks like a pea shooter. You shoot someone with it, and they're like, well, that wasn't too bad. Or it lands on their armor or the outside of their exoskeleton or something like that. And then immediately the generator or the capacitor or the wall outlet near that shocks and incapacitates them. In my head, I very much like that mental tableau. And I just thought that was kind of neat. And to a certain extent, I'm still a small child on the inside, and I like seeing big guns that do funny things periodically. The one that I liked from a plot perspective was the CROM, the Kaleidoscopic Repigmentation Organic Memory Module. I like mage supplements when they tell me something I probably wouldn't have come up with on my own. And the idea essentially of moss that can store laser light as a super high density storage system, I thought was really cool. Also, it's probably the only thing we get where the technical specs of this item are still amazing in today's terms. It indicates that a square platform of 75 millimeters on a side stores 25.5 terabytes. So I like this from a story perspective because, one, you show it to a group, hey, here's something you hadn't thought of before. We're using essentially a moss or a fungus to store information. Two, you have this Johnny Mnemonic scenario where the characters need to deliver a large amount of information from point A to point B. It's fragile, and from an outsider's perspective, it doesn't look that exceptional. And also, you can have the scenario where someone's like, the information we need is here, and they get a glass cylinder covered in fungus, and you're like, okay, anyone got any ideas on how to deal with it? So from a plot angle, I kind of like the idea of maybe a run and gun scene or a chase or something like this where characters have to keep this little glass vial from shattering, or the information required to take down the constructor to reveal the location of the Nefandi call will be lost with it. The thing where I was just like, I don't get it, was the chopper. This is a device that allows you to reprogram areas of the digital web, the compact hypergeometric organization and purification processor. And it's a device that the description of it takes up pretty well an entire page, as many of them do. And you get a backstory about a jackal who is trying to get Virgin Web, but from a systems perspective, it didn't quite make sense to me. It talks about the amount of space that's erased. Okay, so if I get 5 successes in an area, so that would be a 50-meter circle, but I'm in a 100-meter sector, what happens to the remaining sector? What happens if it goes beyond the sector? The digital web book never gave us a good idea of, can you see from one sector into another? What are the areas in between? It was one of those things where this was a constant thing that came up throughout the book. Each round of its use uses 3 points of quintessence, but it has 25 quintessence, which isn't divisible by 3. So what happens? It's an extended action. It has an arete of 5, but it's difficulty 7. What happens if it botches midway through? It just didn't quite hang together. The idea of a push-button way to reformat a sector I thought was interesting. I just thought it was poorly implemented, and I don't know how I would use this exact item. Also, it included the line of, hence Virgin Web is harder to find than a 30-something who hasn't seen Rocky Horror. And I'm like, this book is in no way dated. So that was just one where I went, So I like the cool gun. I like the CROM for the plot object, as characters have to deliver a fungus, but the chopper just left me shrugging my shoulders. What about you, Adam?
For the virtual adepts, what I thought was cool was the Stage 2 Power Glove, which makes people think of the old Nintendo peripheral. But actually, it's a thing that can wrap around a virtual adept's wrist, and so they can crawl into hard-to-reach places and things like that. And then they can pull little things out of this wrist device and have a very compact, very portable sort of computer. They can pull out like a flexible screen, and they can find different, a very different sort of interface. And I thought that was pretty cool because as a storyteller, I've had a number of virtual adept players in the past, and they always had their laptop. They always had it in their arm, and they were always one-handed when these different scenes came up. And I talked to them, I was like, oh, don't you think that's kind of bad? Like, no, I'm cool. I'm going to keep doing this. Like, all right. So I just think it's kind of neat to be able to show them another option, kind of break out of the box a bit. For something you could build a story around, I also picked the CROM, the KROMM. I thought that was a really cool idea. And the points Terry mentions certainly came to mind. What I was also thinking was, it describes in the book how this has been a very useful technology among the virtual adepts, and it's becoming more and more popular. There are more virtual adepts who are either buying it or trading with each other so that they can get a hold of it and use it themselves. And because it is so atypical for the kinds of tech that the virtual adepts use, it is open to mistrust. If you remember our episode on the first virtual adept tradition book, there's a lot of mention about how they don't trust the outside world. They often don't even trust each other. They keep themselves kind of as loners. And so I can see a plot built around how this technology that all these different virtual adepts are now using and starting to adopt, they're going to hear that it is a plot from the progenitors to infiltrate their hideouts or their networks. And so they're going to have a problem dealing with the progenitors suddenly. And even you could turn that on its head and say that the technocracy puts out these messages in the digital web that it's tainted by the progenitors, when actually it isn't. It's perfectly fine. But now all of a sudden you have all this mistrust. You have virtual adepts turning on each other, perhaps even attacking each other's sanctums or chantries over this when technology is fine. So I thought that was pretty cool. When it comes to something I just really didn't like, at the end of this chapter is McPherson's pen. Apparently there was this virtual adept who decided, hey, I'm going to one-up everybody by taking these 3 or 4 virtual adept created technologies and put them all into one device. And it's basically a fat writing pen. And it has incorporated into it all these different technologies that we've already read about in the chapter, like 1 or 2 pages before. And so I was reading this, it's like, I'm sorry, this doesn't excite me. Anybody could look at 2 or 3 items in here and say, I'm going to combine it in one device. And if you take up a whole page or a whole column of text by just telling me, yeah, I put them all together, it's like, I'm sorry, I'm not impressed. You're going to have to do better than that.
Yeah, and it kind of continues the trend that occurs throughout the Virtual Adept chapter where it's like, what if we put a computer inside of a pen? What if we put it inside of a watch? What if we put it inside of a glove? What if we put it inside of a hat? And you're like, oh, we get it. Especially because the Virtual Adept book does such a good job of being like, hey, Virtual Adepts don't have to just use computers. They could use musical instruments. They could use calculators and other ways of doing it. And we get none of that. So as happens with a lot of the books, when all the traditions are brought together, they're very quickly reduced to stereotypes. And they also mention that some of these items are like vulgar as all get out. And you're like, really? Like, it's a pen. No one's going to realize that it's even a computer in a lot of cases. And in some cases, they're like, if people don't realize what it's doing, it's not vulgar. And in other cases, if they do realize what it's doing, it's vulgar. And like, it's not even consistent for that. So yeah, I can just say, cram it to McPherson's Eternal Greatness, the Assuredness pen, or whatever it is. So
yeah. Well, now for the scientists with a capital S, the etherites. Terry, what's a cool item from that chapter?
Cool item, hands down, Doc Eon's action jacket. This is my favorite kind of talisman because as a storyteller, it is fantastically easy for me to keep track of. It gives you 4 soak levels. That's it. It doesn't give you any dexterity impediment to it, and I like the fact that it specifically says, keeps you warm in cold climates and cool in hot climates. And this, just like when we were talking about Sorcerer, and I'm reading through and it's like, these will grant ultimate power. And then I find the potion where it's like, 1 hour of sleep a night is enough for you to feel well rested. And I'm like, oh my God, I would sell my soul for that. This is one of those things where it's like, this is a rocket pack, but this is a functional jacket. And I'm like, oh my God, take all of my money now. It's a simple item. It's coincidental. It fits very thematically. It deals with one of the key problems of mages in general being squishy compared to other night folk. And it also specifically mentions that it has a lot of pockets, which allows mages to avoid the instant charisma killer of cargo shorts. So I like that. I also like that it has the infinity symbol on it. It has a stylized sand clock, which I assume is just an hourglass. And it's just straightforward. If there's going to be a permanent magical device, that's one I can get behind. And I think in 20th edition parlance, that is a trinket, something that's been magically fortified. And I really like it. And they're entirely coincidental and they can be used by anyone, so you can spread the love around. On the other end of the spectrum, the thing that I think is absolutely stupid are the rocket shoes, the Blade Blaster brand rocket blades. So at the end of each episode, Adam provides story hooks, which I always like. And recently, several listeners have said that they like too, which pleases me because I don't think Adam always believes me and he thinks I'm just being nice. So it always helps to have reinforcement in that. And I want to start Terry's Pedantry Corner, where I pick on something esoteric that just makes no sense. And if I were to add that segment to the show, the Blade Blaster brand rocket blades would be one of the first things because it indicates that you go from 0 to 200 miles per hour in 20 feet. And back of the envelope calculation, that is 80 G's. That would turn you into a jar of jam. Just for reference, that is twice the highest force ever experienced on a rocket sled and is something akin to being on the nose cone of a sprint missile. So, your character's not going to live through that. And we don't get any information that there's a forces effect that makes it so you can survive that. So I'm like, oh man, this is a great thing that you give to someone you don't like. You have them put them on, activate it, and either Paradox kills them if the thing is unsuccessful, or they're turned into a liquefied form if it does. So this is this is an incredibly esoteric way of doing it. The thing that I like from a story perspective, and this has always been my favorite wonder, is Zelly's Eternal Theater. It's a unique item that was built by Sir Lawrence Lewis to amuse his bed-stricken dying niece, and it is a ornate little theater in a Victorian box with hand-painted scenes of an opera house on its side, and it has balconies and chandeliers and so on, and it has 4 characters: the lady, the gentleman, the thief, and the monkey. And every time you play it, you get a little new play. It reprograms itself and rewrites itself between each use, and this is something a storyteller can give. This can be a pure MacGuffin of you need to save this, you need to rescue it. It can be used to give out plot clues, but just the idea of it is very romantic to me, of a Society of Ether member using this device to amuse a child and making it their greatest piece of work that doesn't really play into the Ascension War, but just shows a very human side of Mage. You can use it to drop those plot options if you want. You can have the thing of, should we destroy this beautiful object to figure out what makes it tick? And I just really liked it. For something that is more neat in-game, I liked the Elmart, which was the device that turns you into sentient electricity that allows you to zoom around the internet. But Zelly's Eternal Theater, hands down, is my favorite item, even if it's not something I would use a lot in-game. Just the idea of it, I think, very much humanizes the Society of Ether and shows a different side of what it's like to be a mage. My final note on this chapter, I'm cheating, is on page 35. It very specifically mentions Jetboy and Doc Eon. And Jetboy is a character I hated because the chariot in the Mage Tarot shows a person with a wand of some sort riding an ether ship, and it is not Zarvargo, but apparently Jetboy, despite the fact that also in that tarot set there's a boy with a jetpack on who is not Jetboy. But I think this is the first mention of Jetboy that I can remember. So I'm like, okay, Jetboy does exist. So, and that is mentioned in the Havoc Gun section. What were your favorites, Adam?
Well, for the Sons of Ether chapter, I got to say, I almost picked for my cool thing the Doc Eon's jackets, because as I was reading this chapter, I was like, I'm a Doc Eon fan. I just got to say it. I was reading the jackets like, oh my gosh, there's jackets. They're still left. They have his logo on it. Can I have one? If I pay a whole lot of money, can I have one? I promise not to pose in front of machine guns. I just want to wear it. I thought that was just awesome. But for my cool thing, what I chose was Dr. Wingback's Etherjet Rocket Pack. And despite the funny name, it's a jetpack. Of course, that's something that the Sons of Ether are going to invent. It's something that's been mentioned in Mage books before. It's a natural thing to bring into a game. Could be a lot of fun as long as it's not abused. But I just think it's really cool how they gave us a short description, some very practical rules on how to use it. It's like, look, this is how fast it goes. These are the skill rolls you make when you're trying to figure it out. How you maneuver, how it's fueled, and when it's used up. It's just, that is really handy. That's one of those things that I could have a lot of fun with. But as someone who's not really an expert with rules, if I tried to sit down and what rules would I put on this, that would take me some time, and honestly, it might be something I would put off. But to just hand it to me like this, it's like, thank you so much. Now, for something you could build a story around, I picked Doc Eon's Lemurian lightning gun. And the fact that it came from the Hollow Earth is a plus for me, but that's not really why I chose it. It is basically, it's an energy gun, but it looks like a really antiquated dueling pistol from, I guess I would say, perhaps 1700s. And it has Lemurian characters, carved all around it. And it's made of, very precious material. When you point it at someone and fire on them, it does standard forces damage. So it's not a really powerful gun, but as a story idea, I think it has a lot of merit because it is immune to paradox. And there are very few things in Mage that are immune to paradox because, if you do that too much, you're going to be stretching the themes of the game and inviting a lot of munchkin kind of behavior from your players. Munchkin means someone who wants to kill everybody, wreck everything, look really cool, and doesn't give a darn about anything else. But in this instance, this one time, I think it's okay because I remember in the first edition days, especially on Anders' Mage page, there was a lot of speculation in the Mage universe of what is paradox? Where does it come from? How do you make more of it or less of it? How do you attract it more efficiently or repel it more efficiently? And of course, in the first edition core book, there's descriptions of mages trying to escape paradox and instead getting bitten really hard by it. And so I think it's really cool that you have this device that is totally immune to paradox, is totally mysterious. It comes from an ancient culture, on the Hollow Earth, so it could lead players to the Hollow Earth and make them think, oh, maybe humans aren't the only people on Earth who have been using sphere magic. Maybe there was this ancient race from long ago that did it way better, and they've got records. Maybe we can go find them. And so, yeah, I can see story ideas coming out of this, even if the players don't go to Hollow Earth. So I just thought that was pretty cool. Let's see, for something that just did not work for me, the plutonium pill. There's a somewhat humorous description next to a humorous illustration of a scientist who wanted to become smarter and damn the consequences. And so he would swallow this pill, and for a short time, it would make him a super genius. But of course, there's side effects. Your head swells up like a blimp. And this is, of course, a reference to a lot of Pulp Fiction and 1950s and before kind of stories about aliens or super scientists who are so smart their heads are big, which of course looks ridiculous to us now. But it's kind of fun to put a hint of nostalgia in there. I picked this as lame not just because of the silly imagery, but you look at the stats. Every pill has an arete of 3, and so you roll 3 dice to see, what do I get out of it? Well, the rules say for every 2 successes, you can add 1 to a mental attribute or a knowledge. And of course, it's addictive and you want more and more. And every time you take it, the period of time where you benefit gets smaller and smaller. But if you're taking all of the hits for that, all the negative side effects, and you're getting at most 1 additional dot to your intelligence or your science skill, it's like, then what's the point? I got a big risk, very little payoff, and you're telling me my character's going to want to take it again and again? It's like, no, I'm not going to want to take it again and again. That's stupid.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the dice pools and the quintessence and the background points in a lot of cases didn't quite add up for the game. The illustration of it is pretty great. That I'm not sure what's going on with that mouse, whether they're enjoying it or not, but I'll assume that they are, and that no actual rodents were harmed in the creation of this.
Yeah, it's the illustration. The scientist is holding this rat, and the head is not there. Instead, there's like this glass case with this little mechanical object in there. And so, hey, I'm going to give it the favorable interpretation and say that the rat body is also mechanical and just made to look like a rat's body. But some viewer discretion is advised.
One of the things that came up a bunch of times in the Sons of Ether section that I'm not sure how to deal with is when it makes mention of, for lack of a better term, magical ingredients. For example, the Vroom Vroom Boom is powered by solarium gas, and Doc Eon's lightning gun uses polarium and moonstones. How, as a storyteller, would you treat those? Are those things that a character has to find that do actually have their own properties? Or is it one of those things, it allows the thing to work because the scientist thinks it will allow it to work? In the same way that Eye of Newt doesn't necessarily actually have magical properties to it. It's just part of this potion or what have you.
When I was reading through the chapter, I got the impression that those were like bonuses. Basically, I got the impression that the writers were assuming that the Mage fan would read that and say, oh, if I want to make this a part of my chronicle, I will, and if I don't care, then I won't mention it. For example, the Vrum Vrum Boom, which is a joke on Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, it runs on solarium gas, and so a storyteller could say to their players, look, you turn the key and the engine turns on. The player's like, oh, let's use this, and isn't that fun? And once it runs out of juice, then the storyteller could basically do some hand waving and say, okay, well, take it back to the Son of Ether chantry, and there's a wire that plugs in the side, and you can repower it, and you can use it. Just, I don't care. I just want to use this in scenes, and I just will. And that's fine. And the other idea is, okay, if you want to like actually, get into it, if you've got a player character who is a son of Ether or daughter of Ether, and they want to, ask, well, what's under the hood? I'm interested. Then you can say, okay, well, this thing runs on solarium gas, and that is a particular form of TAS that you can get at these 2 or 3 Etherite chantries. And so when it runs out of juice, you've got to go talk to some scientists with a capital S at those locations. And so this is an opportunity to have that player character gain new allies or contacts, and they have to get this special form of task from that other chantry. Otherwise, they can't make the machine go. And so this is for a storyteller who like actually wants to get into the weeds. They want to get into the nuts and bolts. It's like, look, if you have this material, you can use this device. And if you don't have that material, then I've got a carrot to hold in front of you to drive you to some scenes and some plot points that I want to get you into.
I like that. Thank you.
Well, hey, why don't we walk into the chapter on the technocrats? Black hats and mirror shades.
So I am once again going to cheat and indicate 2 cool items because they are cool for very different reasons. The first one that I would allow my players to use is the Universal Identification Card Kit, which is a card you flash, and it is the ultimate fake ID. It will turn into a police badge. It will turn into office park badge to identify you or anything like that. I love the fact that it is a great case for an object to kind of have a mind of its own. It gives the example of a character having problems because they flashed this, and the device said that they were Agent Fox Mulder, who was the protagonist to the TV series The X-Files. And I like the idea that a character who maybe just narrowly fails a role could get a partial success in the form of, oh yeah, it identifies you as the right type of person, but it creates this complication. It shows you flash your badge, it has the appropriate numbers on it or serial code or whatever, and the door allows you to make in, but it says that you're the CEO, and you now have to fake that. Or it says that you're this person or that person, and people now have expectations of you. Or people think that you're a minor celebrity of some sort. I like that it's one of those things that makes success interesting, where, okay, you got what you want, but you also got this other thing that goes with it. Just from a purely narrative sense, I liked the Erg Cola because something that I hadn't considered prior to this book is that internally within the technocracy, people are always probably fighting for funding. So even among technocrats, there is probably fierce advertising to convince other agents to use the products and items that your group produces. That way there's more demand and you'll probably get more funding for it. So throughout the technocratic section, there are these little ads. And at first I'm like, this is stupid. None of this stuff is being sold to sleepers. Who cares? And then 2 thoughts occurred to me. One, it'll eventually be sold to sleepers. The Syndicate is trying to make these things within the consensus over time. And also you have this other thing where if you can convince other technomancers to want and use your product, chances are your funding will increase. And Erg Cola was one of those examples. And that was something that I kind of liked. As far as an item that I just don't care for, the Paranoia Cubes. I, as a storyteller, am never quite sure how to convey to a player subtle mind effects. And it's one of those things where I hate having to tell a player, yeah, I know this is what you would normally do, but this guy used this thing and you have to roll with it, but only to a little bit. And I think that's asking a lot of players. I could see maybe using it on other characters, but I, as a storyteller, am not hugely comfortable with generally 2-dot and 3-dot mind effects. As far as the coolest things or the thing that I would introduce into a plot, if it were something that I wanted to have as a MacGuffin, the Via Silicos, the Via Silicos are these for lack of a better term, crystal balls. And I really liked the idea that they're status symbols above, within the technocracy. That in addition to your rank, whether it's a T1 through a T6 or your level of enlightenment or your position, they're still, despite them being supposedly enlightened and being free from regular wants, they're still like, I want that. And I really like the idea that this is a good area where you could have internecine fighting within the technocracy, people jockeying for position and power, or maybe people stealing it from one another. And I just like it there being this network of people that own them, kind of like you have fan clubs for people that have DeLoreans or other cars that are kind of considered to be these specific objects. And I like the idea of that existing within the technocracy.
When it comes to the Technocrat chapter, this had more devices than any other chapter, which, okay, makes sense. I thought for the cool item, I chose Seekers, which are genetically modified cockroaches. Okay, kind of gross, I got to admit. But I thought this was an idea that was so simple and yet so useful that it just struck me as brilliant from a storyteller's point of view. The progenitors took cockroaches and they said, look, these things breed fast and people are used to seeing them everywhere, and they're pretty survivable compared to a lot of other small creatures. And so we're going to genetically modify this thing so that it will sense quintessence and head for it. And not only that, but it is going to have connected to it, I think it was influenza, very, very serious flu, so that when it gets to a node, chantry, sanctum, whoever is there is going to get sick from this thing being nearby. It's going to spread germs. And not only that, when the cockroach reaches the place where it notes a task or quintessence, it just dies. And then it releases trace amounts of pheromones, which a human or even a dog cannot smell with their nose, but the progenitors has special machines that can detect that. And so they can follow the clues or follow the indicators, and they can locate nodes, chantries, and sanctums of their opponents in the Ascension War. And so I thought that was just so cool. And one of the things that struck me was there are a number of times where there will be a talisman, a wonder in the rule books, and it'll do a certain thing a certain way. And I'll think, okay, as a mystic talisman, yeah, that works. As a technomagical device, that's stretching believability and the ideas of technomagic too far, so I'm not going to let that be a device. But this is one of those cases where I look at everything that these seekers, these genetically modified cockroaches, can do. I would say that works as a technomagical device. That does not work as a mystical talisman. So I thought that was very clever, very useful. It's one of those great ideas where, hey, look, we put a little bit into this and we get really nice results out of it. For the story idea, a little overlap here with Terry, I also chose what they call the Lesser Via Silicos, which are a holdover from the old Order of Reason and I guess it's the Renaissance period where the game Sorcerer's Crusade is located. And at the very last page of this book, Technomancer's Toybox that I have in my hand, there's an advertisement, full-page ad for the Sorcerer's Crusade coming out in the summer of 1498, which, kind of a joke, it's the summer of 1998. But so there's a little connection between the two games there. But I like the idea of introducing a chunk of history into the game. The players are probably going to have this notion of, the technocracy. They're all about modern times, modern technology. That I get that. That's what we're dealing with. And they break into a stronghold or hideout of the technocrats, and they find this basically crystal ball that works along more mystical lines than modern technological lines. And they say, oh, this is a holdover from the past. This is something the technocracy had in their former days when they were not so technological. And so that little link to history, I think is really handy. It makes the players want to, in the game, the characters are going to look into the past and see what other clues are we going to find in the technocracy's past that is going to better explain the present. And so I really enjoy the challenge of building a story around that one. As for something that I thought just did not like, I chose the Block Party Videos. This is a chain of video rental stores, whether it's DVD or VHS. They didn't specify, I don't think. And it's run by the New World Order. And in order to rent videos, you have to fill out this long form that gives more personal information than you would probably like to give. And then everybody takes the videos home, and it can have subtle influences on people through technomagical mind effects, etc. And Yeah, I get that this is a joke on Blockbuster Video, which in the 90s was a big thing. Now it's almost completely out of business. Back in the 90s, people would like to go to video rental stores and see what's on the shelf, and that was a big deal. Now everybody gets it through internet or mail. So, yeah, you could say this is something that didn't age well. But aside from that, I just thought it was kind of dumb. It's like, look, the New World Order is trying to get people's personal information. Yeah, I know that. That's a big aspect of the game. We're all very well versed in that after reading this far into the game books. And people take these devices home and it has subtle effects on them. It's like, yeah, again, that's one of the trademarks of the technocracy. That's really drilled into us by now. Putting this into this book is just superfluous. It's like you're telling me two things I already know, and it's not even that much fun, and the joke isn't that funny to me. So it's like I just don't care.
Yeah, this seems like it should have been a chapter, like a little paragraph in, here's an example of how the technocracy works in the New World Order. This is the kind of way their business opportunity interweaves with their social support, and the subtle they live thing of like subliminal messaging was a very 70s through 90s thing. I think we are down to our last Blockbuster Video that's still open in like Anchorage, Alaska or something like that. I don't quite recall. But since you and I mentioned the same thing, I'm going to use this as a cheat to include a second item, Juego no Sabrio. I like the idea. These are these essentially mechs where these World War II veterans kind of are connected to these exoskeleton combat suits and stand about 3 meters tall. And I think it asks two interesting questions. One is the idea of the notion of the technocracy pushing to augment people, where it's a case of, okay, you're no longer physically capable, but you have decades of training and good reflexes and good combat skills. How can we still make you useful in the Ascension War? This is one way to do it. And they talk about these characters as modern-day samurai and still following this code of ethics, which is kind of interesting. Sometimes the exoticism that comes with like, oh, the samurai is the ultimate warrior kind of makes me roll my eyes a little bit. But at the same time, like, what do these characters do during their downtime? These people are in this suit. If they were to leave it, they would die. So are there constructs that just kind of have these things walking around where you can go to the cafeteria and there's this 10-foot tall samurai suit there, or that one of the characters in one of these suits leads a class on tactics? And I kind of like that it brings up that question. And then on the next page 66, we get this illustration where it shows this what appears to be a woman with a little gun and a big gun inside some sort of construct, and then behind her is this reptile xenomorph space alien thing. And the first time I looked at it, I'm like, oh man, the xenomorph is pursuing the woman. And then the second time I'm like, oh no, their guns look super similar. They're probably on the same side. And I like the idea that within the technocracy, we can get very strange entities working side by side. The Void Engineers introduced us to the idea of Lermus, these non-human entities that may be working for the technocracy. And I think this book had an interesting example of it in these characters in samurai suits, who this is how they survive now, and the technocracy has found a way to still harness their expertise and skill to admittedly probably butcher and destroy traditionalists, but still they have their place within the technocratic machine.
Yeah, and as I was reading the description there on how they took veteran Japanese soldiers of World War II, who of course are going to be older men now, and they extended their life and kept using them. I was thinking of that element of manipulation, of taking advantage, because, of course, in World War II, the government of Japan was saying a lot of things to the population, and especially to the soldiers serving in their military at the time, about the Shinto cult of the emperor and how important it was to keep that alive from foreigners who are going to try and snuff out all Japanese culture. And they were saying a lot of things like that. They were really taking elements from Japanese culture and taking advantage of that with their soldiers. And so this idea of you've got the technocracy who says, yeah, we can take people from nowadays and manipulate them, but isn't it easier for us to take these older men who have already been conditioned and manipulated and just do it more. And it's like, I was reading through it, it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, you could really have some scenes where the players are in a position to have a conversation with one of these technomagical vets and hear their point of view and go, oh my gosh, I thought my life was bad. Holy cow, this guy beats me in every department. So there's some good role-playing potential there.
Yeah, and it's one of those ones where you can take it in a lot of directions. It can be the technocracy gave me new life and allows me to continue to serve towards a greater good, or alternatively, they have taken advantage of the fact that I was a broken person who had been beaten down by a different system and said, here's a beaten down person who's used to dealing with systems. Guess what we are as the technocracy? It gives you a bunch of interesting options.
Well, I think at this point we are ready to move into the chapter on the others. And, I'm just going to say up front, a little, not very much, but a little disappointing for me because I was hoping to see more Nefandi and Marauder technomagical devices, and we saw really very few. And we saw a whole lot from the Cult of Ecstasy. I guess the Cult of Ecstasy just really got into the whole mad scientist electronics workbench thing for some reason. But
they had a real Radio Shack phase, yeah.
I guess so.
So, as far as the items that were in this section, the item that I thought was cool was the VBC3 biocomputer and MindLink XF251. This is an item that, at least plot-wise, I thought was a super interesting idea, and it's basically this plant computer. As presented, I think it's a little fragile where like viruses kill it immediately, but it also mentions that most other systems don't necessarily identify it as a normal computer. And this reminded me of in Neuromancer, there is the idea of a slow virus that systems are poised to defend themselves from incoming viruses or worms or Trojans or malware or what have you. But if it's something where the data is introduced very slowly over time and maybe changes a little bit and subtly, that can overcome system defenses in this particular model presented by William Gibson. And I like the idea of a plant-based computer doing the same thing and just kind of doing things differently, and software, anti-intrusion software, not necessarily recognizing it. And I also like the idea that this thing in the digital web would literally be vines, that there are sectors that might be taken over by biological computation, and the virtual adepts or the iterators or the Sons of Ether are just not sure what to make of this. And now that other groups have figured out other methods of computation, because DNA is remarkably effective at data storage over long terms and has some pretty amazing error correction. I like the idea of other modes of computation. And I think Mage is at its best when it talks about ideas that aren't necessarily possible now or not very common now, but there's no reason why they couldn't be the case. And I thought this was an interesting example of that. The useful item was the Spiritus Vacuum. I have always had difficulty with, as a storyteller, kind of dealing with characters who have like the spirit magnet merit or flaw, where they are being constantly either harangued or helped by spirits. It's one of those things that can turn into a get out of jail free card, or it's one of those things that's constantly annoying to have to role play. And I like the idea of this vacuum cleaner that has the ability to suck up spirits. And I think it's also cool because it shows how another tradition could approach things. I could perfectly see a Society of Ether member being like, I don't know what the spirit is, but it seems to observe these certain laws. And it's basically the vacuum cleaner version of the proton packs from the Ghostbusters. And I am perfectly fine introducing that into my game. And it's one of those things where you get to use it a couple of times. It does what it needs to do, and then it goes away. So I can see me arming my characters with this for some Umbral excursion where I basically say, here's a get out of an encounter free card where you're just like, I don't want to have to deal with this person right now, or we are tired of dealing with spirits right now. Okay, we're going to take out the vacuum, we're going to shove you into a little capsule, and we're going to deal with you later. We need to keep moving with the plot. And I liked that as an idea. I thought it was a little much that in world it's listed as the character being kicked out of the tradition for lack of respect, and I'm like, okay. The thing I just didn't know what to do with it was Sin TV. This is part of the BDSM theme, seemingly, that fits through all of Maid's second edition, where people, you need to learn how to draw a zipper if you're going to continue with this theme. These things are just wildly impractical. And this is based on the art for this device. Now, this is a television that tunes in to the life of what is happening around the user and exposing dark secrets, and people get addicted to watching it. And the weird thing about it is the TV is able to change viewing angles and maybe adjust sound levels and so on. And I'm just like, okay, how do I use this? Is this just something where I create plot threads, or alternatively I have to do the thing where people are getting addicted to it, and I'm just not sure how to use it like successfully in a chronicle. I kind of get the idea of it, and maybe using it as a way of indicating that a character is weird or obsessed with other people, but it's just kind of one of those ones where I went,
Yeah, I chose the same thing for what I thought was just dopey, ridiculous, was Sin TV, invented by an ecstatic as a means to use low-level correspondence to spy on people who are fairly nearby. It says that he lived in an apartment building and he spied on other apartments in the building and across the street, etc. And it just did not interest me at all. I thought it was a waste of page space because it's basically saying mages can use low-level correspondence to spy on a lot of the people, and that might become addictive, and it's kind of creepy. And it's like, well, yeah, I agree, but I knew that already. I thought we all kind of knew that. And here you're putting this device saying you could use this in your chronicles. Like, no, I couldn't. I mean, I already understand that theme, and I don't want to use it in my chronicle. It's not even interesting. It's just reinforcing something we already knew. But let's move on to something that I thought was cool. I liked Mad Mook's Million Eyes on the World, and this is a marauder device. Basically, years back, there were those turn a quarter and pull something out of the vending machine at the checkout area of a grocery store. So little kids would go over and they'd get little plastic toys. And there were these little eyeball things within a clear plastic case where it's like you could rotate the case, but the eye was always looking up or whatever. And I never bought them. I thought they were kind of dumb when I was a kid. But my friends had them. And so, yeah, I get that kids love that stuff. And here we have this sort of sinister idea of a marauder is putting a subtle influence on these, and it sort of nudges people towards madness or to separation from other people around them. And the insidious thing about it is there's just countless, back in the 90s, there were just countless trinkets like this for kids to get in the grocery store. They were everywhere. And so to say that maybe 10% of them or 20% of them are tainted, but the rest are just perfectly normal, it's like I can see how if players tried to get, stamp this out or remove it from their neighborhood, it would drive them absolutely nuts. And I just like the idea of having this subtle hint that the marauder is not just nuts wandering through their life, reacting to things immediately around them, but they actually have a plan. They're actually, trying to do something in the world, and they're you should try and think about what is this marauder after, and is there anyone working with them? And so I kind of like that idea. For story idea, the VBC biocomputer and the vines coming out of it that a person could use as a mind link. I chose that for my story idea because I just thought it was fascinating to have this very, very strange technomagical device that is kind of a computer, but in another sense, it's kind of not a computer. It's so different from other computers that if that links to a network, it's probably going to be a real darn different network. And so I started thinking, hey, what if we were to say that there was some alien or umbrood or maybe the Nefandi that had this information network that they've had around for many, many years, but it was so different from human information networks that they were hoping the humans would never catch on to it. And so now you can say perhaps the lords of the umbral courts or the Nefandi or something, they have this system of passing around messages and information to each other, and now the players have stumbled onto it, and the players have got this clue that, oh my gosh, there's this huge thing going on. Nobody knew about it for years. And now we got to go and tell our allies in Mage Society. And are they even going to believe us? I mean, how can we prove this? So I thought a lot of cool story ideas could come out of that for storytellers who want to latch on to the ideas there.
Yup.
Well, now we're ready to wander into the appendix. The appendix it's interesting. In 1996, there was a supplement for General Purpose World of Darkness. It was not connected to any of the 5 big games like Vampire, Werewolf, Changeling, etc. It was just World of Darkness Combat. Here's more detailed skills for physical combat. Here's more weapons to use in your gunfights and car chases. It's called the Big Book of Beating Ass, and that just speaks volumes to me. But I mention it because it seems that they took some material and some ideas from this, and they sort of condensed it down, and they plopped it into the appendix for us. And so in this appendix, we get non-magical weapons and equipment. We get military vehicles. We get what are called support weapons. It's not just a weapon that one man is going to use to defend himself. It's a weapon that one or two or even three people are going to use to defend their squad of troops on the battlefield in a real war. And so, we've got heavy-duty flamethrowers, big machine guns that are so large even two people couldn't pick it up. It has to be mounted on something. I mean, these are literally the big guns, specialized equipment, stuff like that. We also have an optional rule on blast recovery and two skills for jury rigging and security. And so this appendix gives us a number of things that you might want to use in a more action-packed chronicle or a more technologically, scientifically minded chronicle. So Terry and I are each going to share something that we thought was cool and something that we thought was dorky from this chapter, and then we'll move on to talk about the optional skills and rules.
The thing that I thought was cool was the introduction of the support weapons. I think answers a vital question of, oh no, how do we deal with werewolves? Where are we going to get silver weapons and so on? And then you go to yourself, you're like, well, the shell casing on this 105 millimeter cannon is kind of silvery. Let's see if it kills a werewolf. And guess what? It does, because it does 20 dice of damage. And it's one of those things where one of the things about V5 is the idea that it's like, the Tremere Chantry in Vienna has never been infiltrated. In the 800 years it's been operational, no force on Earth could destroy it. Except for mortal governments using a drone strike, because it's perfectly possible to blow up a vampire, because at the end of the day, they're just kind of meat too. So I kind of like that reminder that at the end of the day, the nitrogen-nitrogen triple bond found within a lot of explosives is one of the most effective ways of dealing with night folk. And some people will be like, this is just an action-packed campaign. I'm like, at the end of the day, sometimes the easiest way to deal with the Methuselah is a tow missile. I'm just putting that out there, and it doesn't occur. No paradox.
There are a lot of intelligent, cerebral suspense movies where the hero is not punching or shooting people. He's figuring out the bad guy's plans. And at the end of the movie, he sits back in a chair and he says, call in the troops, and the troops make mincemeat of the place with heavy-duty machine guns, and the hero is not holding a machine gun. But it's a great addition to the movie.
It's almost like that's why we invented these things. The thing I found kind of stupid is I always wince a little when we get a new skill. It's one of those things where I kind of wish jury rigging had been, the way the different traditions kind of get unique little abilities of their own, like, dream speakers have the ability to walk from the dreaming into the blah-de-blah, and cultists of ecstasy are super good with layering perceptions on top of each other and so on. I wanted jury rigging to be the Son of Ether or the Society of Ether ability, where it's just something that these people are so good that they have the ability to do this kind of semi-magical thing, kind of like the way the first edition Virtual Adepts could use, what was it? It was like Mind 2 or Mind 3 plus Subterfuge or what have you to do social engineering. I wanted jury rigging to be kind of semi-magical, where someone squints at it and goes, is that enlightened or is that not? And you're not quite sure. But for a brief period of time, you get to absolutely MacGyver something. You get to put something together to do this awesome effect to get an object to temporarily work, or you use it to bypass a trap or something like that. And I wish it were that. And anytime you add a new skill, you're making the game kind of harder, because once it exists, it's an item you can call upon that if your characters don't have, they're kind of being penalized for it. And I'm just like, So anytime new skills are introduced out of nowhere, I'm like, why are we doing this, guys? But that's me. What were your thoughts on the appendix?
The optional rule was make it easier to recover from blast damage. Basically, shield yourself or move, roll with the blast or something, which is not 100% realistic. But we see it in action movies again and again. And this optional rule, I think it's great for a high-octane, heavy-action chronicle. If you were to drop that rule in there, it's like, yeah, now my players can do more action scenes and survive through more dramatic action. And it's like, yeah, that's great. If you want a more realistic, character-driven, down-to-earth kind of chronicle, then no, don't use this optional rule. It's going to, blow everything and make it dumb. So used properly, I think it's fine. But used in every chronicle, no, I don't recommend that. When it comes to the two new skills, security and jury rigging, security is, I understand high-tech modern security systems. I understand the infrared laser beams that are hard to see with the unaided eye, the tripwires, etc. I think that is like the secondary skills from the Book of Shadows, which is the first edition Mage Player's Guide. In the right chronicle, it lets your players focus in more detail on the things that they care about and that interest them. But in the wrong chronicle, it just adds complexity. It adds more rules. So I think both of those skills could be folded into the general purpose, I think technology skill. I think it's fine there for most chronicles. But if you've got a lot of technomages or players who are like really, really detail-oriented, it's like, no, I want to slow down and hear in detail how this security system is made. I don't want to just say, I beat it, let's move on. It's like, okay, put these skills in and your players and storytellers are going to have fun with it. So used properly, great. Used everywhere, stupid. Now, as for something I really liked in here, I had an emotional reaction, I'm sorry to say, for the M79 grenade launcher. And no, I don't have any guns or grenade launchers. I never want to kill another person. But I like action movies. And I read the manga story Pineapple Army by Kudo Kazuya and Urasawa Naoki. And it's from a few years back. It's about a man who trained with paramilitary, but he's not a soldier. And so he hires himself out to protect people and advise people on how to protect themselves when they're in a risky situation. And so the main character of this story goes to some third world nation to protect some downtrodden people. And the warlord assholes of that area are trying to kill everybody. And so the main character takes this M79 grenade launcher and uses it like a boss. It is basically a fat, stubby shotgun that holds one grenade at a time. And these grenades are not like hand grenades. They look like a big, fat bullet. But it's not actually a metal shell, a metal bullet. It's an exploding grenade on impact. And so the barrel holds one grenade at a time. And so you basically, for lack of a better term, you crack it in half on its hinge, and you put the new one in and snap it back, and then you fire it like you would a shotgun. But it's got quite a kickback on it. And so you have to kind of, get some experience with it before you can just use it. But yeah, there was one story in this manga where the main character was just using it all sorts of ways, and it was just totally awesome. And so when I saw this in the book, I was like, oh yes, this is cool. I would love to show my players what a person can do with this, because this is awesome. In stories, not in real life. I don't want to kill anybody. But the thing that I thought was dumb was they have a listing for a hot air balloon. Oh, it was so informative. Did you know that the speed of a hot air balloon depends on the wind? It's like, blew my mind. And of course, even today in modern times, the basket hanging under the balloon that people stand in, it's really made of wicker or something very much like wicker, or synthetic plastic that is, like wicker. And did you know that gives armor of 0 against weapons? Like, I had no idea. You mean I can't pick up wicker deck furniture and stop bullets? I never knew that. Thank you so much for helping me understand this concept.
And that is valuable space that could have been filled with more information on void ships. So I like that also in that same aircraft section, there's a military utility copter immediately below it, but whatever software is being used, it looks like it overflowed the tab spacing, and everything is offset by 1. So it looks like the military utility chopper has a maneuverability of 280, where most things are on like a 1 to 10 scale. And I was pretty pleased with that. Also, speaking of typography, this book doesn't really use superscripts or anything. So weird things about weapons are denoted by using ampersands or @ symbols or the $sign or exclamation marks or percent markers. So it just, if you go down the weapon column in the military vehicle, it just looks like it's cursing, because it's just this mix of punctuation that it's like a Growlix or something like that. And I'm like, that's kind of funny. And you're like, 1990s publishing. Yeah.
Yeah, in old books, when they wanted to have a little note at the bottom, they'd put an asterisk. And if they had two on the same page, which was kind of unusual, then the second one would be a tiny little cross. And then pushing the boundary for a third thing, there would be two little crosses right next to each other. Mm-hmm. And, years ago, that was supposed to be the extent of it. And so this is like they amped it up to 11 and said, what's every key, what's every symbol on the keyboard that is not a letter or a number? Let's put it in there. And so reading through it, it's like, okay, there's notes at the bottom. Okay, I get it. But boy, this is fun to look at.
Yeah. This weapon has a tilde next to it. That means it does freezing damage. Oh yeah, that was obvious.
Well, moving on into the general discussion of this book, and of can't get the term magic item out of my head, but talismans, wonders, technomagical devices. What's the difference between a New World Order energy rifle and a really good gun? I think it's helpful for storytellers to emphasize that to their players, that it adds something to Mage when done well. And I think the book did not ignore this. I was kind of worried when I started this book that they would just say, here's some really cool high-tech devices, and by the way, they're magical, and you get it, and move on. It's like, no, I think they handled it pretty well. Technomagical devices in Mage are subject to paradox. And of course, sometimes that's going to manifest in the form of, it's broken and it doesn't work and nobody can make it work. And so now you have to push it aside and do something else. So that makes the technomages treat these items differently. If I've got a really cool high-tech device, it's like sometimes, with my friends or family, I want to show it off. It's like, look, this thing is cool. Look at this. But technomages, it's going to be the opposite. It's like, no, this thing is... I'm going to try to keep this really low key. I'm only going to pull it out if I need to. I'm just going to use it a little and put it away again. I'm not going to draw attention to this thing. And so I like how that is different. That makes techno-magical devices different in Mage. Most of these use up their quintessence pretty quickly, and so that makes them more special. It's like, look, I can use this a little, but I can't use it all day long. And to recharge it, I've got to have TAS or take it back to a construct or chantry for etherites and recharge it specially. I can't just plug this into the wall wherever I am and juice it up again like I can with my smartphone. So that, again, it makes it different. It makes it stand out. But as a storyteller, I might like to push things even a step further. And I would like to say that even techno-magical devices, there's something inherently magical about them, even if technomages would rather avoid that fact. And that is odd coincidences. It can attract odd beings. Even though some storytellers might think it's silly, I might actually try once in a chronicle having some sort of invisible umbrood infect a technomagical device so that when the technomage tries to use it, they just get like barking or grunting noises or something, or odd displays. So it's like, yeah, there's an umbrood in here. I wanted to ignore the Umbra and think I'm in a very modern society, but the Umbra won't ignore me. Or, for example, with a technomagical device that gets you through security procedures, or a super souped-up kind of badge with a micro LED screen that can change its own display. What if every time you use it, an attractive member or the sex that the player is attracted to introduces herself and asks for your phone number, or your something like that? So it's like every time I use this device, this weird occurrence happens again and again and again. Something odd is going on here. I can't just ignore this.
My overall thoughts on the book were, in the plus column, this book was dripping with flavor. One of the things that I super like about the revised era convention books is it includes a lot of names, a lot of numbers, a lot of locations. They're not extensive, but there's a lot of in-world flavor that makes the Mage world feel more lived in than often the very small stories that we get like in a tradition book. And I like that we have various doctors that you can talk about, or mad inventors, or people with scores to settle, that even if you're not going to use them, they're names you can use or character concepts you can use, which is kind of cool. On the other end of the spectrum, there's a bunch of things where like there's a lot of souped up guns, which I get, but in almost all cases, just having a shotgun is better, where it's going to do more damage. It's not vulgar. It's easier to conceal. A mortal can use it. It's not like the guns are, in a lot of cases, are stipulated as like, oh, this does aggravated damage or anything like that. So in most cases, just having a big gun does better than having the Technomancer equivalent to it. The X314 Thunderbird is listed as weighing 10 kilograms, which is 20 pounds, which is an impossibly heavy handgun. Like, I've handled a Desert Eagle. You could use one as a crowbar. If you put wheels on a Desert Eagle, you get a cannon. And still, that only weighs about 5 pounds. So some of the things didn't quite hang together. And there are other cases where the wheels kind of fell off for me. Mad Mook, the little eyeball rings, are listed as thousands of them being in existence, where if you look at the standard rules for producing a magical item, that would imply that Mad Mook had access to tens or possibly hundreds of thousands of points of quintessence. So you're like, I have enough power to create a realm the size of Dewizatep or Horizon, but instead I'm going to put weird eyeball rings throughout all of the mortal world, which actually works for a Marauder. I get that, but still, it's one of the things that just didn't quite hang together. And a bunch of the items had weird rules that were outside of the sphere system, and a lot of them were flavorful, but I don't know how I would use it in a chronicle. Like, if a character's like, yeah, this item has this side effect that I really like, how do I recreate that? And you're like, we don't have any rules for that. And a bunch of the items are like, it's up to the storyteller. I'm like, thanks, good thing I paid for this. But on the whole, it's very flavorful, and that I liked, even if not everything works narratively. It's there, which I thought was cool. And in the process, I tend to like to double check a lot of the science that goes into some of these things wherever possible. But the Corelli's Badass Jackhammer, which is one of the most straightforward namings we get in all of that, indicates that it is a jackhammer that weighs 20 pounds. I'm like, 20 pounds? There aren't jackhammers that small. Actually, there are jackhammers that small. And in the process of researching that, the Chicago Tribune in 2019 published a consumer review on the best jackhammers. And I am just thrilled to pieces that the Chicago Tribune did a consumer comparison on the best jackhammer. And they have a 55-pounder that they recommend, and I thought that was very nice of them. So I got to discover the world of consumer jackhammer reviews in the process of doing this. That is Terry's pedantry note for this issue, in addition to the fact that the rocket boots would instantly kill you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, moving on to talk just from general ideas I was having about talismans, wonders, and devices. I actually like the idea of taking a really powerful wonder or device and just letting the players have access to it. I mean, if it's a really powerful weapon or a really powerful, transport enabling device or something like that, something that is just really, really potent. And the players are like, oh, I'm going to use this all the time because, players are like that. And let them have fun with it. Let them just go wild for a couple of game sessions and then take it away. Say it breaks or someone steals it or the true owner shows up and indisputably he's going to take it back or something like that. I think it's fun to just give basically, the old expression is you wouldn't give a machine gun to a grade school kid. It's like, well, of course you wouldn't. But I mean, just the idea of giving a really powerful thing to someone who doesn't understand it and is going to abuse it is like, no, I throw it out to my players, let them go nuts. And after a few game sessions, I take away. It's like, okay, we're done now. Also, I like the idea of a talisman that has more abilities in it, but the player hasn't unlocked it yet. And so, like, if a player gets curious about the talisman, instead of just use it and forget it, they actually ask me about it. It's like, well, if I look into this or ask around, it's like, can I learn more about this thing? And I like the idea of there's more there for you to get. Now, of course, a lot of storytellers are going to be worried about, well, they've got a powerful item and this is tipping game balance. I don't want to do that even more. It's like, okay, I understand that idea, and I've encountered it too. But these abilities that get unlocked, I think it's fun to have a player, put in the work and unlock the ability, use it for maybe one game session, and then point out how that is this new ability is something that is very useful to a chantry or a faction of mages, but it's unreasonable for an individual. And so at that point, basically, the player gives the talisman away to other mages. And that's how you build a rapport with another faction or a chantry or something. You can build allies, contacts. You can become an honorary member, which is basically like having a dot or two in the node background. You can get more quintessence for that player character. I mean, there's benefits for interacting with the talisman, and then when it gets too powerful for your chronicle, move it out, but give the player something in return, so they don't feel cheated. It's like, oh man, I unlocked this thing, and my reward is I lose it. That sucks. So yeah, I can understand how a player would feel that way. And also, I really like the idea of, for a technomagical device, if a player unlocks the other ability, then you use that as an opportunity for a new mentor. It's like they unlock the ability, they do something cool with it, but then, the real owner shows up or they have to give it to a chantry or something. But then in the next game session, this reclusive technomancer scientist appears, and he's been out in a orbital construct, and he says, "You are the only person to figure out this technomagical device. In the past 5 years, I passed out 20 of these, and you're the only guy who got it. Now you are worthy to be taught the science of advanced dynamatics." And so now you can learn something that other people don't. So you can use that as a way to give a mentor to a player or open up a new line of study for them. So that can be done with talismans. And I guess my final note is I would like everyone to know that Andre's Mage Page 2.0 has a page on what is in that day was called talismans. There are technomagical devices there. There are a lot of mystic talismans as well, and grimoires and related things. I think it's just a lot of fun to get some ideas kickstarted. So we're going to put that link in the show notes for everybody. And really, that wraps up my thoughts on talismans for today. Terry?
Yeah, I like the first point you made about the idea of let the players play with something vastly beyond their power range for a brief period of time. Mage is usually a game about the cost of failure, what happens if we don't succeed. Exalted is a different game and is often a game where it's very high power and you're rolling like 60 dice at one time. It's a very high action, high adrenaline game that kind of uses a modified storyteller system, and to the point where I refer to 20 d10s as an exalted of dice. That's like the collective noun I use for dice, in the same way that 15 six-sided die are a shadow run of dice. And that is a game of success. Like, what is the cost of succeeding? What's the thing that happens when you actually get what you want or do what you need to? And a very potent item lets you do the same thing. It's like, okay, yeah, you've blasted your enemies to oblivion. Now what? Or like, I guess you have to deal with the fact that, yep, you destroyed that technocracy construct, and they were keeping out the Zigruggler, so that's on you now, buddy. And a super potent item will let you temporarily do that. The other consideration I have is, I like Adam's recommendation that if you have to give up an item, you should get something in exchange. Chronicles of Darkness has the idea of the sanctity of merits, which is if something narratively forces you to lose a merit or a background, you should allow the player to turn that into something else. And because they paid for it, they spent their game time, their player coins to get this thing. You shouldn't just take it away from them. Let them turn it into something else. And you lose the talisman but gain a mentor, I think is a really neat play on that. The other option that you have is, as presented, talismans are very expensive. Either they cost a lot of background points or they cost a lot of in-game time. Another option you have is something I have stolen before from the world of Monty Cook's game. He did Numenera and Invisible Sun and a couple of other games. And the idea there is Monty wants you to always have new things to play with. So items are useful and powerful, but only work a certain number of times. So you can allow players with much less difficulty and much less effort create objects of power that have some sort of depletion to them. That you can only use this item 4 times, or every time you use this item, we're going to roll, and after the use, if the die comes up a 1, that item just doesn't work anymore. It no longer costs a point of willpower to create, and it no longer takes hundreds of points of quintessence to manufacture. It's just only going to work for a short number of uses. So it's one of those things where you have it, but you may not be able to depend on it forever, and that is an option for storytellers like me who are afraid of permanently expanding the magical capabilities of a character. And I think that's all I had, except for my quote of the episode, which I can drop in now. This is the line that most thoroughly dates the book, and the line is, as you might expect, TDSPVs are rarer than a Bill Clinton bumper sticker at a hacker convention.
Yeah, that was definitely dating that section.
Yep. And you'll note that I successfully avoided the quote about people rubbing each other's suits in space. So normally I go for the weird sex thing. This time I decided not to. I went for the Bill Clinton thing, which I guess you could also consider a weird sex thing. But anyway, you want to...
Terry, even when you surprise us, you surprise us.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, on that note, I believe we're drawing to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening, everybody. We enjoyed bringing this episode to you. If you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and TuneIn, and other sources as well. If you like the show, others might like it too. And if you leave a review of Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible to other people's searches. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. Great place to not only listen to episodes, but to scroll back and see the older ones in something like the order they were brought to you, and a great place to find all the show notes that we put together for you. You can listen to all kinds of things there. We even have a few other notes for you to see. This episode is thanks to executive producers Ira Grace, Richard Bat Brewster, John Magnuson, Bryce Perry, Brandon Morrill, Andrew Katz, Michael Parker, Anders, and Justin. If you would like to become an executive producer and help us goof off on the internet, I mean, to bring quality content to our intelligent listeners, that's what we're doing, right, Terry? You can help us do that by becoming an executive producer, and we would certainly appreciate that. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started if you're interested. Well, thanks, everyone, for listening. Until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
Next book we read is Digital Web. We are in a rich seam of technomancy. And with that, bye.